There were two questions as a non-believer that I was asking of the New Testament. The first one was, can we hold the New Testament in our hand and say what we have is what was written down, or has it been changed? I've already looked at that in a number of segments, but the second question was even more important to me. Was what was written down true? Did Jesus actually do that? Did he actually say that? I'd like to walk you eventually through 4 lines of reasoning. Now, it might take 10 or 12 segments to do it, but 4 or 5 lines of reasoning that brought me to the conclusion that I can hold the New Testament in my hand and have confidence that what it says is what happened and what Jesus said and what Jesus did. That first line of reasoning is this. The writers of the New Testament, the apostles, they wrote as eyewitnesses or they recorded eyewitness accounts. Matthew, Mark, and John in any court of law would be considered eyewitness accounts. Now, even though Mark wasn't, you say, what? No. Mark didn't observe much of what he wrote about in the Gospel of Mark. You say, why didn't he? For this reason. Mark was a scribe. He copied down all that who said? Peter. Peter was the eyewitness, and he was simply writing down what Peter had seen and heard personally. So that would be in an eyewitness account. Now, Luke was not. Luke was assigned to examine everything carefully from the various eyewitness accounts. You see, there were many, many records of what Jesus has said and did. And the New Testament church was so committed to accuracy. They were so committed, they want to know exactly what Christ taught. Why? One, they were dying for it. They wanted to know that it was the truth if they were going to give their lives for it. So Luke was given the assignment, and he says in Luke 1:1-3, that he examined everything carefully from the beginning from those who were eyewitnesses to check out each element to see that it's accurate. And then he said to write out the exact truth of what has been taught among us. So Matthew, Mark, and John were eyewitnesses. Luke recorded his gospel from those who were eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses are so critical when it comes to understanding anything about history. Dr. Louis Gottschalk, graduate professor of history at University of Chicago, wrote a book, an excellent book called Understanding History. You know why it's so good? It takes the very scholarly, intricate things about understanding history and makes it simple. And in his book, Understanding History, Louis Gottschalk says this: the ability to tell the truth rests in part upon the witness's nearness to the event. Nearness is here used in both a geographical and a chronological sense. Now, what does that mean? Well, geographical means in physical presence. In other words, the closer to the event you are physically, the better. And then chronological, time-wise. The closer you are time-wise to the event, usually the greater the accuracy. In other words, if you were an eyewitness. You know, in the New Testament, they were so concerned about truth. And with the apostles, they would say, well, how do you know Jesus said that? How do you guys really know he did that? Just like we ask today, in the New Testament church they were asking that because they were so committed to truth. And so John gives an answer to them of how he had a confidence that what they were saying about what Jesus said and Jesus did was true. And this is in 1 John 1. In verses 1-3. Now look, you possibly have read it many times, but most people kind of skip over it because there doesn't seem to be any substance there. But what is there is far more important than a lot of the substance. What is there? John is telling how he and the other apostles had confidence about what Jesus said and did. Listen to what he said. What we have heard with our own ears, not with somebody else, what we have heard with our own ears, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have handled with our hands, we declare unto you. In other words, he was saying, look, we were eyewitnesses. We were there. We all heard him say this. We heard him do this. And Jesus wouldn't say something just once. He'd say it over and over and over again. And so he said, look, we have a confidence in what we're saying because our ears heard it, our eyes saw it, and our hands handled it. You can't get much closer to a person or an event in history to record what happened than what the apostles did with Jesus. How do we know that Jesus actually said that or actually did that? One of the first lines of reasoning that I went to was they wrote as eyewitnesses what their ears had heard, what their eyes had seen, what their hands had handled. And Justice Ruffin, in the case of State versus Morris, made this observation: all trials, all legal proceedings proceed upon the idea that some confidence is due to human testimony. Some of the best testimony we have historically is eyewitness testimony. Now, there are problems with that. I mean, you can perceive it wrong and everything else. And this is why it's good to have multiple eyewitness testimony. In the book of Acts, in chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, the apostles, in their own words, was telling what had happened after Jesus was crucified, killed, and buried, and what happened on the third day. Listen to what they said. To these apostles, to us, they said, he also presented himself alive after his sufferings by many convincing proofs. Now think of this. The disciples are saying that he appeared to us and convinced us with many convincing proofs that he'd been raised from the dead. And then it says this: appearing to them over a period of 40 days. Not 40 hours, not 4 days, but for 40 days he appeared to them. In their own words, they said, with many convincing proofs. In the Greek, it means overwhelming evidence that he'd been raised from the dead. They wrote as eyewitnesses. All the way through the book of Acts, the entire church was founded on eyewitness testimony. For example, in 2 Peter 1:16, Peter said, we did not follow cleverly devised tales. People today say, you can't trust people back there. They couldn't tell the difference between truth and tales, or fact or fiction, or history or hoax. Look, I'll put Paul and Peter and some of the other apostles up against any professor in any university today. Come on, where university professors and all would teach that the Da Vinci Code was true, it was factual. Get real. Listen to what Peter said. He said, we did not follow cleverly devised tales. In other words, he was saying, we know the difference between truth and tales. He said, we didn't follow cleverly devised tales. We made known to you the power and coming of the Lord Jesus. But what were they? He said, we were eyewitnesses. They wrote as eyewitnesses. And that's some of the most powerful testimony we have for any event or person in history. When it comes to eyewitness accounts and their accuracy, it's important to realize that the church, the original foundation of the church, was completely established by eyewitness accounts of Christ after his resurrection. Read the book of Acts. Verse after verse after verse emphasizes this, that they had personally seen him. And for example, in Acts 2:32, God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of the fact. In Acts 3:15, you killed the author of life, but God raised him to life, and we are witnesses of this fact. In Acts 4, for we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. It wasn't hearsay or whatever. It was eyewitness testimony. In Acts 5, the God of our fathers raised Jesus from the dead. We are witnesses of these things. And then it goes on to say, we are witnesses of everything he did in the country of the Jews and Jerusalem. They killed him by hanging him on a tree. But God raised him from the dead on the third day and caused him to be seen. The entire church, the Christianity, was founded on eyewitness accounts that on the third day Christ was raised from the dead. I concluded that if I cannot trust them who signed their testimonies in blood, who went through the test of death to determine their veracity, then I can't trust anyone. And I'd have to be a total historic agnostic and couldn't believe anything that I ever heard. I believe that what I have in my hands in the New Testament contains exactly what Jesus said and Jesus did, because one, it was recorded by eyewitnesses, and that is one of the best testimonies we have historically. Now, the second test, you might say, that I applied was this. Was the truth presented in the presence of knowledgeable, hostile people, where if it were false, it would be proven to be? You say, what do you mean? Well, when something is presented, if it is false, are there knowledgeable people there that could falsify it? This completely happened in the New Testament.